All right, chapter 3. We left off discussing a little bit about classical and neoclassical ideologies of studying criminology, and a couple philosophers were mentioned, and we're going to go a little bit into detail about those philosophers. Did we touch on Cesare Beccaria last week, or last time we met? So Cesare Beccaria and Jeremy Bentham are going to be two of the primary philosophers that we'll be discussing, and they give a lot of their studies, which led to opinions on punishment and how to prevent crime and things like that. Cesare Beccaria. He wrote an essay called Essays on Crimes and Punishments. I want you to remember the name of the work that he made. Essays on Crimes and Punishment. That came out in the 1700s, 1764. One of the main things that he wrote about in that essay was punishment. Not necessarily the need for it, but exactly how much punishment is necessary for crimes that are committed. Saying that the punishment, we all heard the term that punishment should fit the crime. Well, in his, I want to give you his wording here. He said punishment should be based on the degree of injury caused rather than the criminal intent. So when we say punishment should fit the crime, essentially what he was getting at was that if it is a major injury caused to the victim of that crime, and I think we talked about that in another class, not necessarily this class, the definition of injury. Injury isn't necessarily the idea that you have a physical wound caused by a crime. I mean, that would be a crime if this person would cause that, but you could be injured by a crime, a property crime. If you have your wallet stolen, your purse stolen, your house broken into, these all cause a type of injury to you. So when we say that the amount of injury caused by the crime should be the determining factor for how much punishment is doled out, that's what we mean, not necessarily the physical amount of medical treatment that you need. The other punishment factor they talked about was the motivating factor for why we punish. I know we talked about that. Give me some reasons why we punish folks. And you can exchange the word punishment for discipline. You can talk about children, employees, students. Why do we hand out punishments or discipline? Keep people from doing things we don't want them to do. How does that work? Or why does it work? In what way does it work? If we punish somebody, what about punishment keeps them from doing the things that we don't want them to do?
Risk versus reward.
Risk versus reward. So punishment hurts. Again, not necessarily in the physical sense, but it stinks to get punished, to get disciplined. If as a police officer or some sort of law enforcement officer, you commit a minor misconduct, you make a mistake, and that mistake is determined to be a punishable disciplinary mistake. What are some of the punishments that can be handed down to police officers? I'm sorry? I didn't hear. Suspended. That's a pretty common one, right? So you can take suspension days. Suspension days are days where you don't come to work and you don't get paid. So what is the injury there?
Not getting paid.
Not getting paid, right? We all work to get paid. I mean, hopefully you work in a job where you enjoy it, but the idea that your primary motivating factor in working is to get paid, if that is taken away from you, then that is the punishment, that is the injury that is being caused through punishment. So by knowing that can happen to you, then hopefully you make better decisions. So we make a decision that factors in, well, I don't want to get suspended, or even up the ante even more. I don't want to get terminated. I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to get fired. I don't want to go to jail. Like the odds, the risk can go higher and higher given the amount of, or the level of misconduct. So what Beccaria was talking about was we don't always need to be heavy-handed in the punishment. We need to let the offense determine the level of the punishment. If we just have a wide sweeping, every time somebody makes a mistake in whatever job, we're just going to fire them. That's not necessarily an effective way of doing business. Everybody's running scared of making any little mistake. However, there has to be a level of discipline, level of punishment, whether it be for criminal activity or for administrative violations in our job. But we have to let the level of mistake determine the level of punishment. That's what Beccaria said. Is that a reasonable idea? Are there, because what's our other option? If we don't let the level of crime determine the level of punishment, the level of mistake, what other determining factors do we have? You could let the level of how much you like the person determine it, I guess. One option. I'm just trying to think of some other. You could let your mood for the day, if you're the final adjudicator, the one who hands out the punishments, you could let your mood determine how the punishment comes down, if you're the judge or the jury. But it's a more fair, according to Beccaria, it's a more fair determining factor to keep it equal. Every person that commits this crime should get this punishment. That way we're not showing favorites and things like that. And in doing so, then punishment isn't the end of the story. Somebody brought up you hand out punishment or discipline to prevent future behavior, unwanted future behavior, to change that behavior. So if we look at punishment as just the middle of the story, which is what Beccaria did, then punishment is not the end of the story. It's not the end. He said it's a means to an end. So the end of the story is looking to see, did that behavior actually change? If you only stop at punishment, then it just becomes punishment for the sake of hurting someone because you just didn't like what they did. If you look at punishment as an idea of, I don't want them to do that again, so let's see if this punishment works, and then they don't do that, then your relationship in that dynamic doesn't end with the punishment, it ends on a more positive note. I mean, if you compare that to back to discipline for children, if a parent gets mad and physically doles out punishment to a child versus a parent realizing that the child doesn't need to do that anymore, whatever behavior that they were doing, whether it be getting too close to a electrical socket or something like that. If you're mad at the child for getting close to the electrical socket versus, okay, I don't want them to get hurt, and if I can hand out this punishment, this discipline, so that they don't do it in the future, which one of those is a more healthy way of looking at the behavioral change? The one that doesn't end with you mad and just lashing out. It's the one that actually showing that the motivation for the discipline is an idea that, hey, I don't want this, I don't want future injury to occur, and in this case it'd be literal injury, to occur to the child. Beccaria also he strayed away from punishment and started talking about defenses. I know we spoke earlier on in the semester about the idea that you can have alibis for crimes, you can have a defense for a crime, and you can have an excuse for a crime. A defense for a crime would be we use self-defense. So if you end up shooting someone, usually that's against the law. But if you can show, hey, they were shooting at me and I had to protect myself, protect my family, and that's why I was shooting back at them, that's a defense. Whereas if you shoot someone and your attorney, your defense attorney says, yeah, my client did shoot them, but my client has some mental issues. They don't deserve to go to prison for the rest of their life. They need help. They shot them, but they need help. Can we plead to a lesser crime and put them in some sort of mental health facility for the next 20 years instead of prison? That's not necessarily a defense. We would categorize that as an excuse because yes, the crime was committed, but here's why. That's the difference between a defense and an excuse. A successful defense will result in an acquittal, a not guilty finding. A successful excuse, if it's successful, will not result in somebody walking out of prison scot-free. There's still going to be some repercussions and consequences if somebody uses an excuse versus a defense. But sometimes an excuse is all they have. I mean, they did the crime, but we have a reason why they did it. So that brings me to something that Beccaria talked about, proof. We have perfect and imperfect proof. I want to use, let's see. If we have a suspect. The suspect is arrested for possession with the intent to sell narcotics. They've got a bunch of dope in their pocket, bunch of money, whatever it takes to, in your mind, create that scenario where there's enough evidence to support them being arrested for possession of narcotics with the intent to sell. We go to trial. What are some defenses that can be created? What are some? How can the suspect who's arrested defend themselves? Not excuses, but actual defenses that are going to result in them being found not guilty. What about saying the officer planted it on them? Is that could that be a defense? Yeah. It was in an envelope. I didn't know it was in the envelope, and somebody told me to hold it. A defense. I'm not saying the most reasonable defenses, but it's a defense. If that suspect can successfully show to the jury that the officer planted the narcotics on them, or they were holding an envelope, they had no idea it was in that envelope. If they successfully convince the jury of that, what's the result? Right, not guilty. Right? If they're successful, it's going to be not guilty, right? So Beccaria was talking about the two types of proof. That would be the first guy. That'd be perfect proof. Because when you have perfect proof, you've shown your side of the story and you're found not guilty. But then you have imperfect proof, which is kind of like an excuse. The difference between having a defense and having an excuse. So if you have imperfect proof, you're going to prove that you didn't necessarily commit this crime, but maybe at the same time admit to a lesser crime. An imperfect proof is going to say, I didn't do this. Maybe I did something, but I'm not saying what you said I did. So perfect resulting in a complete finding of not guilty. So if we take that same scenario, suspect is arrested, pocket full of dope, arrested for possession with the intent to sell. What lesser crime can we have? Here we go. So what would we have to say? What's our imperfect proof of just possession over possession for sales?
I didn't plan on selling it.
Here we go. I mean, that's going to be your story. If you stick to that story and you're able to convince the jury, I had a pocket full of dope. I just have a really heavy habit. I had a pocket full of money because I just cashed my paycheck. That money just happens to be in tens, fives, and ones because that's how I asked for it from the bank. I have a receipt for it. Here's a receipt. They gave me a bunch of tens, fives, and ones. I just don't like 20s. Why is that important? Why is it important that there's a bunch of tens, fives, and ones instead of 20s? A lot of folks don't buy $20 worth of narcotics. They buy $5 worth of narcotics, something like that. And so if you end up coming up with somebody with a pocket full of dope, and they have, instead of a bunch of $100 bills in their pocket, they got a bunch of tens, fives, and ones, it shows that they're making smaller transactions. So that's going to be one of the not necessarily the elements of a crime, because there's no crime against having tens, fives, and ones, but it's the part of the expertise of somebody who's investigating narcotic crime. If you stop somebody with a pocket full of dope and a bunch of money, and that money happens to be in smaller denominations, it's a red flag. So the suspect, the arrestee, or in this case, the defendant, is able to successfully show, I have a really heavy habit, I just cashed my check, I like tens, fives, and ones. If they can successfully show that those fact patterns are true, what is going to be the result of that trial? If the jury believes, or the judge was the judicial trial, if the hearing body believes what the offender is saying, they have a heavy habit, they didn't necessarily mean to sell all these drugs, and the money had no factor in the possession of those narcotics they intend to sell. What would be the result of that proof?
Not guilty of possession of sales, but
Right.
guilty of possession.
Sure.
Possibly.
Yeah, that's a potential result. Do you get to go free? Are you innocent now, or is that not you? The offender, is the offender innocent of that crime, of any crime? No, we were found not guilty of the possession with intent, but now guilty of a lesser included crime of possession. We call that imperfect proof. Perfect proof results, like we said, in a complete not guilty. Imperfect proof is a defense that will show that you didn't necessarily do what they said you did, but you have to admit to something smaller. Sometimes you just don't have the option of a defense with perfect proof. You just, if you're caught, you're caught, and you just want to lower that crime. The last thing that I want you to remember about Beccaria, Cesare Beccaria. Oaths. He talks a little bit about the oaths that we take in court. Where we raise our right hand right before we testify and swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. I'll preface this with I don't have a great answer for you, but let's talk about it. Why do we do that? Why do we swear before we give testimony in court, do you think? Is swearing on a Bible one of the elements of perjury? Perjury is lying on the stand. Is swearing on a Bible necessarily part of one of those elements? Especially if we don't have a need to swear on a Bible, right? We're not always swearing on a Bible. Sometimes we're raising our right hand. Sometimes if you take an oath, you're taking it on a different religious book or different book at all. There's no necessary requirement for it to be a Bible, a holy Bible. So we don't need that actual book for it to be perjury. So why do we do it? Why do we raise our right hand and promise, swear, affirm? I told you to begin, I don't have an answer for you. It's an interesting concept. An interesting concept for us to do that. But Beccaria was talking about it and he says it's useless. He didn't see a reason for it either. We still do it because just because we have older philosophers doesn't mean we always follow their guidance or their teachings. But it's interesting that even back then, in the 1700s, Beccaria was saying, what are we doing this for? It doesn't mean anything. Can we liken something like that to a superstition? Yeah, a little bit, right? I mean, some would say that religion in general is a superstition. And who am I to say one way or the other? But belief is belief. Belief results in a destination after you die, or it also results in a living a better life while you're here. Then what's the harm per se? But as far as swearing on a specific book to prevent something from lying, there have been a ton of people who've been convicted of perjury who swore not to do it. So the act of perjury isn't prevented by the swearing. Maybe just hold some weight for folks. Maybe you were going to lie and the last second you're told to raise your right hand and maybe give some pause. I'm sorry?
To deter a person away from.
Yeah, maybe. I can see that where you wanted to lie, but then last second, I just told the entire room I wasn't going to. Maybe now they won't. But again, according to Beccaria, he said the act of swearing people into court was a useless idea. All right, Jeremy Bentham. I have mentioned my research in the past. Jeremy Bentham plays a big role in my research. and his philosophical holdings about punishment and deterrence and things like that. So he wrote a book. The wording is a little long, so I'll read it to you. Back in 1789, Jeremy Bentham wrote a book called An Introduction to the Principles of Moral Legislation. An Introduction to the Principles of Moral Legislation. And Bentham uses a term called hedonistic calculus. I know in our intro class yesterday, if you were in the intro class, we discussed this a bit. Hedonistic calculus is, you could narrow it down to a math problem, but it's essentially just calculating the risk and the reward. How much is it going to stink if I get caught versus how great is it going to be if I don't? And you weigh those two options. That's what risk reward is. That's what the cost benefit analysis is. You'll hear about cost benefit analysis in economics, but in life, everything is a cost benefit analysis. Today, coming to work, I did a cost benefit analysis when my alarm went off. How great would it be to lay in bed today versus how much would it stink to lose my job? And I did that cost benefit analysis, and I thought, you know what? The cost of losing my job is more than the benefit of how great it would feel to sleep in today. So I got it. If you consider sleeping in to be wrong, that's what hedonistic is, just wrong. Then you could consider that a hedonistic calculus, but in general, it was a calculus. It was a decision, a cost-benefit analysis. But let's insert something a little more heavy into that equation. If I was running late to work, I know I have to speed. I have to speed to get to work on time. So I have to do, and we'll call speeding, it's wrong. It's against the law. So the hedonistic calculation there is, how much is it going to stink to be late to work? Or how great is it going to be to not be late to work? I should say. How great is it going to be work on time versus how much is it going to stink to get pulled over and get a ticket? That's my calculus. That's my calculation. That's what I have to figure out. Because getting a ticket is going to be bad. It's going to cost me money, things like that. It's going to make me later. But also, being to work on time is going to be pretty great. What's another factor in that calculus? What else can I factor in about being on time or late to work? So I already said it's going to be great to be on time to work. But I also have to factor in, well, how bad is it going to be if I'm late? So I've got two different factors on one side. Okay, it's going to be really good if I'm on time. It's going to be kind of bad if I'm not on time. And it's going to be really bad if I get a ticket. And then I take all those and I do my calculus. And that's going to help me make my decision whether or not I'm going to speed. In theory, according to Bentham, that's going to help me make my decision. We used the example last time of somebody walking by a car with the window down and there's a laptop sitting in the passenger seat. Let's walk through that calculus, that hedonistic calculus. So what would be really great for that criminal? Get a free laptop, right? That'd be great. So what part is not so great? What is the negative aspect of that?
You get caught.
Get caught. What happens if I get caught? Jail, fine, probation, community service, whatever punishment is doled out for that crime, it would stink to have that punishment. But it'd be great to have a laptop because maybe you could sell that laptop, maybe you need a laptop, who knows? There are benefits to crime. I don't think anybody's ever going to say that crime, you'll hear the term crime doesn't pay. Getting caught doesn't pay, usually. But crime in and of itself, there's a huge benefit to crime. Otherwise, you wouldn't do it. There's a huge upside to breaking the law. You get places where you want to go faster, you get a free laptop. If you want to sell drugs, you're making a lot of money. There's a ton of upsides to crime. The downside is getting caught to crime. The downside is getting caught. The downside to crime is getting caught. So that's where we do our balance test. How great is it to commit this crime? And we're going to talk about some of the benefits, the psychological benefits of crime in a moment, versus how negative is it going to be if I get caught. So according to Bentham, we need to adjust that calculus. We have to adjust those scales to prevent crime. How do we adjust them? So on this side, if we know that it's great to get a free laptop and it kind of stinks, or we'll use my speeding. We know it's pretty good to be at work on time, but it's kind of crummy to get a fine of $20. I don't want to give up $20 out of my pocket. That's how much our imaginary fine is for speeding right now. So if it's going to be pretty good to be at work on time. It's going to be a little crummy to shell out $20. I might think, okay, $20, I can afford $20. I'll speed today. How do we change that? How do we tip those scales? How do we convince somebody not to speed then?
Increase the fine.
Okay. So in this case, how much do we have to increase the fine to change somebody's mind? Sure, no, yeah. So now, instead of having that calculus, okay, it cost me $20 to speed, this is how much, we're tipping those scales and we're saying, okay, we have to change punishment so that we decrease crime. We have to make it less worthwhile. Exactly. Because when I made that decision, when I said, oh, I'll pay the $20, in that case, when I made that decision, my mind or my decision was that pain of $20 didn't outweigh the pleasure of being to work on time. Being to work on time is great. And if it's really, really great, and it's only a little bit crummy to lose $20, then the punishment did not outweigh the crime. At some point, we have to keep adding to that punishment until those scales tip and say, now, okay, I'd rather be late than pay $400. At some point, we're going to find that balance, and it's going to tip in the other way. And Beccaria and Bentham both said the same thing. We don't need to keep tipping that scale more and more once we find where that balance is. Because we don't necessarily want to balance. We want to be just slightly out of balance. We want the punishment to be just enough to dissuade somebody from breaking the law. If we keep going, there's no need. Now, this is just excess punishment. But if we don't balance it, if the pleasure still outweighs the pain, then we're going to have people breaking the law. The pleasure being the pleasure of breaking the law. Because last time we met, we used this term, and I want to stress it to you again. When folks make rational decisions, they're going to seek pleasure and avoid pain. So if we tip those scales, if people are going to seek pleasure and avoid pain, the pain being the fine, and the pleasure being work on time, at some point it's going to change hands. The pleasure is going to be in not breaking the law and not getting that fine, and you're going to seek that pleasure. But something to remember when making those decisions, we talked about the rational choice theory. In order for that idea that people are going to make that hedonistic calculation correctly or accurately effectively make those decisions, then the only way they can do that is to assume that the people we're dealing with, they're making the decisions, are rational. If at some point we insert somebody who's irrational for whatever reason, then our hedonistic calculation doesn't work because they're not making that educated, sane, rational decision. They're not literally weighing the costs and the benefits. Other factors are in play. So Bentham also, I want to go over some of these punishments that Bentham came up with. So he categorized a lot of the punishments that we use and that we don't use. So he has 11, I ran out of fingers, but he has 11 different categories of crime, or excuse me, different categories of punishment that can be used to prevent crime. First one is capital punishment. What is that? Yeah, exactly. The death penalty. The ultimate penalty when it comes to preventing crime. That would be an example of an over sentencing if we started putting people to death for speeding. That those balances, the scales aren't necessarily just tipped in the favor of the punishment. It's way out of skew. So that's the ultimate punishment. Afflictive punishment. Afflictive punishment is physical punishment that isn't necessarily death. So we all, we don't necessarily use these types of punishment today for adult offenders, but whipping, any kind of corporal punishment. There was a big story years ago in I believe it was the Philippines or maybe it was Malaysia, where a young man was caught vandalizing cars, and they caned him, which was just taking a cane and hitting him. And that made huge news here in the States, because I believe that it was a U.S. citizen that got caught, but caught breaking somebody else's rules, and so the caning occurred, and everybody's up in arms saying, "Oh, we don't use that type of punishment," but they do there. So it is a type of afflictive punishment. Ignominious punishment. That is, you guys seen the stocks and the pillories where you put your head through in your hands and you sit there and everybody walks by you. Standing up, what is, we don't use those today, but what would be, why do we have those? Why do those exist? What is the motivation behind putting something in public and, I'm sorry, embarrassment? Yeah, sure. Yeah. And by embarrassing them, it could be, I also am going to touch on another one's embarrassment, but it's also in public. So folks can see what happens when you break the law, even if it doesn't embarrass them. Even if somebody's just proud and says, "Yeah, I'm in the stocks and I'm in the pillories," what of it? Maybe somebody walking by thinks, "Well, I don't want to be in those." Regardless of this guy doesn't care. He's acting too cool for school. He's acting like it doesn't bother, but it bother me, so I'm not going to do whatever it is that he did. That is ignominious punishment. Penitential punishment. Penitential punishment. So we've heard the term penitentiary. It doesn't necessarily mean incarceration. Penitential punishment is kind of what you're talking about, the embarrassment factor. So I haven't seen this in a while, but this used to be a little more common, where people's faces would end up on the news when they were arrested for embarrassing crimes, or crimes that we thought they should be embarrassed for. One of the ones I saw most often was prostitution. When Johns would get arrested for prostitution, they would have their names or their faces across the screen. And what's the purpose of doing that? Why would we want to embarrass them?
People from doing it in the future.
I mean, can we stipulate that is embarrassing? If your face was on the news saying that you got arrested for soliciting a prostitute, can we agree that's probably an embarrassing thing for the whole community to see? And we don't want them to do it again. So what is having your face on the news? How does that affect your hedonistic calculus?
It's not worth the reward.
It's super. I mean, that's an emotional risk. Like, you don't want your face. That's really embarrassing. And on top of that, it factors into other folks who are making those decisions. So just like the pillory and the stocks, it makes them want to second guess themselves before they engage in the same punishment the same crime that you did. So it does act as an ignominious punishment as well. So now let's talk about imprisonment, actually incarceration. So don't get penitential punishment confused with penitentiaries, even though it comes from the same root word. Penitential punishment is more of an embarrassment. Chronic punishment is what we would consider actual penitentiaries, prisons, jails, things like that, where you're putting somebody away from society to prevent crime. We've said that there are several ways that putting somebody in prison prevents crimes. There's several theories out there. We talked about the theory of incapacitation. If I put you in jail, then you can't commit any more crimes. If I put you in jail, it's also just flat out punishment, something we're going to discuss. You'll see in the chapter called Just Desserts. It's just, you messed up and bad things should happen to you. You did something bad, so something bad should happen to you. Just desserts. So that's could be a theory of why we put people in jail. If not incapacitation and just desserts, maybe we put somebody in jail because we want them to go into an environment where they can learn other skills to hopefully prevent them from breaking the law. Rehabilitation. So there's a ton of different reasons why we put people in jail, and not the least of which would be if I keep breaking into cars and I'm a plague to society because I won't stop breaking into cars, and you put me in jail, not only does that stop me from breaking into cars as an incapacitation measure, according to the incapacitation theory, because we've said that that's somewhat debunked. Not only does that put me in jail and keep me from breaking into cars, so I'm incapacitated, but who does it protect? Yeah, the people who would have had their cars broken into. So it's a very thin line between those two theories, but the idea that one, if you put me in jail, I'm going to stop doing the crime, but two, if you put somebody in jail, then the folks who would have been victimized are no longer victims. So it's two different ways of looking at that same coin. One, you're focusing on the behavior of the person doing it. Two, you're focusing on the victimality of those who would have been engaged or involved in that crime. Restricted punishment. That's things like if you commit misconduct as a teacher or as a police officer, any job wherein you need a license to do it. Or you speed too much and they take away your driver's license. That'd be a restrictive punishment. When you're taking away a licensure or saying, hey, you can't do this because normally you're allowed to, and now we're going to say temporarily or permanently you can't do this anymore, that's a restrictive punishment. Compulsive punishment. That's going to start digging into your pocketbook. That's going to start digging into your wallet and costing you money. So there's a couple different ways in which the government can take your money. One is this compulsive measure. If I steal one of your watches and I get caught, I go to jail, do you have your watch back? Necessarily, I mean, not necessarily, you don't necessarily have it. I mean, maybe I sold it, maybe it's gone, maybe I broke it, maybe it was a vandalism, maybe I was jealous and I broke it and never getting that back. So by me going to jail, other than making you feel better, are you made whole in that? You're still out the money for the watch, right? So how do we change that? Compulsive punishment. What would I have to do to make him whole? Yeah, I gotta bring him back. Restitution, we call that. You can have restitution hearings. You can have restitution as part of a sentencing. I was going to say for the most part for property crimes, but restitution can be for crimes against a person because what can be a cost of being a victim of a crime against a person? If I stab you, what's the cost to you?
Hospital bills.
Yeah, medical bills. Right. So I can be ordered, even against a crime against a person, I can be ordered restitution to make you whole because it's not fair that you had to pay all these medical bills through no fault of your own. So that's the first part of digging into your pocketbook. That's compulsive punishment. Pecuniary punishment, also digging into your wallet. But in this case, it's not going to the victim of the crime, it's going to the government. Can we think of another word for that? If we get a ticket, is there a victim of that speeding? So who's getting that money when I got to pay that ticket? State, the government. So if the state takes you, it's called a fine, usually, that's the word we use. If you're getting a fine, that would be a pecuniary punishment. There's no victim that's being made whole like a compulsive punishment. It's just, you're just losing money for the sake of losing money that hopefully that punishment will change your mind from doing something. Quasi-pecuniary, so denial of services. if you don't follow the rules, then you can't do something. One of the main, I think, more modern current events situations like that is with masks. There are more and more situations where if there's a mask mandate and you violate that mask mandate, you're not allowed to do certain things. You can't go to concerts or in some cases stores. Or if you're not, if there's a vaccine mandate, then you're taking away a privilege that would have normally been. There are occupations currently that are saying if you have to be vaccinated to work here. And if you don't, it's not necessarily a criminal act, but it still falls under that quasi-pecuniary punishment because you're having a service taken away from you. You can't go to that store anymore. And the final one, characteristic punishments. We could say that characteristic is, we're characterizing somebody as an offender. Are there ways in which we make it very well known that our prisoners are prisoners? If we go to the jail, how can you tell the difference between a guard and a prisoner in the jail?
Stripes.
Uniform, yeah, stripes, orange, whatever it is. There is a character, you're characterizing that person as an offender. And then if you send that person out to do work release, oftentimes they're still wearing those prison uniforms. Are they wearing them because that's the best outfit to get the job done in? Like, is that the best uniform to dig ditches or clean up trash? Is it utility? Is there a utility in wearing that uniform that helps you do that job? Why are they still, if they're not in prison, why are they still wearing that on the side of the road when they're picking up trash?
Differentiate between everybody else.
Yeah, for one, so that if somebody escapes, they're an offender, and two, so you know who's doing that on the side of the road. This person isn't just out of the goodness of their heart picking up trash. This is a prison chain gang, or this is a prison cleaning crew. And if you're driving down the side of the road, you're thinking, well, I don't want to be part of that. These guys are all criminals. They're all offenders. How do I know? Because they've been characterized that way by what they're wearing, that uniform. And it's a part of deterrence. Part of helps you next time you engage in a hedonistic calculus to think, well, I'm not trying to be on the side of the road. So those are the 11 ways that Bentham categorized punishment. I thought we had somebody here that was in corrections previously. Is there anybody in this class?
That's the neutral law.
Oh, okay. Well, Bentham came up with an idea for how to design prisons. He called it panopticon design. So you can design prisons any kind of way. You could put different buildings, different houses. You could put the way neighborhoods are. You could build them, cells right next to each other up in line. You could put 5 stories tall and have rows and rows of cells. Or you can have this panopticon design that Bentham came up with and is still used today. You may hear it called a pod design. So Bentham decided that if you put the guards or the watchers or the supervision, the guards, in the middle, and then have these coming out, and these are where your cells are, that would be a more efficient design than trying to have rows and rows of cells on top of each other, and where you trying to figure out where the most efficient place to put that guard in any particular place. Are you going to have a guard here, a guard here? You have to put one in the middle and one on the end. How is it? When you put all your guards here, and they can have control this way, he called that the panopticon design. I want you to remember that specific term just in case you see it again. So as we transition from Beccaria and Bentham, our classical philosophers, we transition to a more neoclassical time period. Neo just meaning new classical. So it's building upon the classical time periods and the classical philosophers. We come up with an idea or an ideology called positivism. So positivism builds on the ideas of Bentham and Beccaria and all of their peers. But it also says that not everyone is as rational as we had hoped. We have things called hard determinism. That maybe there are just factors in play that are going to ensure that you engage in criminality or don't engage in criminality. Because with Beccaria and Bentham, we said, if you do this calculus, if you're presented with all these ideas, you're going to make a decision one way or the other, and you're going to make in whatever your decision is the right decision, whichever outweighs. But there are other factors in play that are going to affect those decisions, because not everybody's going to make that vacuum-based decision that Beccaria and Bentham thought that people would. What are some other factors in play that help people make decisions to either engage in or not engage in crime? Change it from a laptop to a bag of McDonald's. If you're walking by and you are starving and homeless, or not even homeless, you're just starving, and you know that the sentence for taking McDonald's out of this car is going to be 5 years in prison if you're caught. If you're not hungry versus when you are hungry, is that going to affect your decision making? And you're not in control necessarily of when you're going to be hungry or the circumstances that led you to be hungry. That determinism is an idea that says that it's not necessarily in your control how rational you're going to be. In a vacuum, walking by, I can say, okay, I really like McDonald's, but I don't want 5 years in prison, so I'm not going to take that McDonald's. I'm going to make a rational choice. But it's not nearly as rational if you throw in other factors like hunger. Like, well, I'm going to do a lot of stuff to make sure that I stay alive, and I'm going to risk a lot more. So a huge aspect of that classical ideology is the fact that we have free will. When I walk by that car with a laptop at McDonald's, I get to decide if I'm going to take that laptop. Nobody's deciding for me. Nobody's gonna make. As a person with free will, I'm going to decide and use that hedonistic calculus. However, you factor in, and I'll use hunger again. You factor in hunger. Do I necessarily have as much free will if I'm dying? If I'm literally starving, is there as much free will when I see that McDonald's, or is it more survival? Survival. Like the idea that I can make this the rational choice is thrown out the window. So when we talk about positivism and the neoclassical philosophy, philosophical ideologies, free will takes a back seat when compared to the classical ideologies. The neoclassical ideologies talk about character development, what it is that develops who we are. Classical philosophers didn't care about how we became who we are. We talked about it in other classes. We all ended up in this classroom today via different means. We either grew up with 2 parents, or 1 parent, or no parents. We could have been raised by our grandparent. We could have been raised by no parents. We could have been, this could be our 3rd school or our 1st school. You could have a master's degree and you come back because you really want to take my class. And that's a different path. You could be in high school. You could be interested in this class because you've been arrested 15 times and you're curious about the criminal justice program, or you've been arrested no times and you're interested. So the path to be interested and end up in this class is a ton of different ways. And we have to take that into account when making our decisions. All of those are going to factor in when I use that example of the alarm going off and that cost-benefit analysis. The risk versus reward, when we do that rational choice, that hedonistic calculation of sleeping in today. It's not just sleeping in, that alarm goes off, either I go to class or I don't go to class. if, I'll use myself as the example. So my alarm goes off this morning. Initially, when I use that example, I said, I don't want to lose my job, or I do want to sleep in. Those are my two choices. But there's a ton of different factors that get factored into that. If my father has impressed upon me that this is what he wanted me to do my entire life, he wanted me to teach criminal justice classes, and that's all he talked about when I was growing up. Do you think that's going to have an impact on how hard I try to keep this job? Yeah. Part of the way he raised me in that scenario is going to factor in my hedonistic calculation, my cost-benefit analysis. Now it's not just, hey, I don't want to lose my job because I like getting paid, and I might want to sleep in. Now I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to disappoint my father, which is huge. But we could change that up. What if I didn't have a father? Raised by a single mother. And then we have different priorities. And those priorities were, she had to work several jobs to make sure that I could get my education and have this class. The end result of that motivation may still be the same. I don't want to disappoint her because she put me through school so I can have this class. My level of desire hasn't changed, but my rationale for that desire is different. And we need to factor those into, if you're talking about, as you look at the neoclassical ideologies, we factor in how people became who they became, as opposed to just this vacuum of, okay, I want to get up or I don't want to get up. There's a lot more factors into it in the neoclassical ideologies. Make sure I hit on all the points I wanted to hit. Write this down, please. Robert Martinson. We talked about the prevention of crime. If we keep increasing that punishment until we finally prevent crime, Robert Martinson had this theory called the nothing works doctrine. And in his mind, I'd like to read up on it, in his mind, just what it says, nothing works. No matter what we do, there's still gonna be crime. We can keep increasing punishment, nothing works. Keep that in mind. David Fogel brought up the idea that not only do we need to prevent crime and tilt the scales to prevent crime, but we need to, when we catch people, hold them accountable. There has to be a punishment factor of that prevention. Merely just tipping those scales to prevent crime isn't enough. We have to, when we find folks, which is a little bit different than what Bentham and Beccaria said, we're at just enough punishment to prevent that crime. Fogel said, you know what? Forget those guys. They broke the law. They need to be punished. Just deserts. You made your bed, now you lie in it. A good example of that ideology is the 3 strikes law. We punish folks in the most recent ideations of those. You'll see if you commit 2 violent crimes and you commit a 3rd felony, then you're in jail for life. The rationale for the 3 strikes penalty is twofold. One, just deserts, like I said. The other one is incapacitation. The final thing I want to talk about is, we talked about hard determinism, soft determinism. The idea of making it more difficult to make that decision to break the law. So repeatedly, I've used this example. You walk by a car with the window down and the laptop in the passenger seat. And we said, how do we make that a more difficult decision? And what some of you said was we increased the penalty. Eventually, if you keep increasing that penalty, then people won't want to break that law. What if we roll up that window instead? What if instead of relying on the offender to be rational, we take some accountability as a potential victim and we make some decisions? So we said that the offender is only going to commit crimes that are worthwhile to them, and that the cost outweighs, or the benefit outweighs the cost. But how about this? Roll up your window, or don't put your laptop in the passenger seat in plain view. Lock it, hide it, keep it. That's going to be an idea of soft determinism. That is a soft way of ensuring that crime doesn't occur, because The idea of determinism is it's going, it's going to happen. There's a destiny to behave a certain way based on factors, whether it be how you were raised, your socioeconomic status, your exposure to criminality, things like that. But instead of a hard determinism like those factors, soft determinism would be the potential victim taking action to prevent that crime. Another word for that, a more proper term for that, is a situational choice theory. That folks are going to make those decisions not necessarily based on exclusively what Bentham and Beccaria said, where if you just increase the penalty, it's going to change their mind. But we can also change their mind by making the act itself more difficult. You may hear the term harden the target. Rolling the window up on a car with a laptop on the passenger seat is hardening the target. It makes it more difficult to get that laptop. They can't just reach in. Now they have to break the window or break in the lock. Or if you put that in the trunk, now they have to go into the trunk to get it. Or if you put that laptop in your house, now they have to go all the way into your house to get it. You're making it more and more difficult for this potential offender to break the law and thereby they have to make these more hedonistic calculations because you've made it more difficult. Not necessarily based purely on punishment and reward, pain and pleasure, but now we're including pain, pleasure, as well as adding environmental design. Environmental design is how we create the environment around us to make it more difficult for folks to break the law. Putting a lock on a door is part of environmental design. Putting security lights outside. Putting a floodlight that goes off when there's motion. That's an environmental design. And it's going to add to that situational choice theory that says that folks are going to not only factor in pain and pleasure, but also factor in the difficulty of the environment. Let's critique rational choice a bit. We didn't just live it. When I said what factors are not being, when we say rational choice, and remember that's pain versus pleasure, we're taking into account if I break the law, then something bad's going to happen to me. And those are the only two factors being taken into consideration. Why is that not necessarily a valid theory? What did we just say about environment? Is there more to the decision to break the law than just pain and pleasure? According to the neoclassical theory, there is. The idea that you can, people make those decisions based on the difficulty of committing that crime as a factor, but also where we come from is going to factor into our agreeability to engage in criminality. If I'm starving, it's going to factor into my decision on whether or not I'm going to steal this food, regardless of if I know I'm going to prison or not, because I have to live. Values change depending on how you're raised. Crimes become more and more serious depending on where you come from. How you were raised may determine speeding. Either speeding is a really big deal depending on how you were raised, or it's not a big deal. Maybe you shot the thing, not a big deal, depending on what environment you come from. Or maybe it's a huge deal. And that's going to factor into your cost-benefit analysis, your hedonistic calculus on whether or not you break the law. That's a critique to the rational choice theory. And the other critique that I want to talk about is you have to be rational in order to properly engage in the rational choice, properly apply the rational choice theory. People that are not rational, like it's assumed that Bentham and Beccaria assumed when they made those theories that they're making the assumption that everybody's rational. You're not rational if you have mental health issues sometimes. You're going to engage in crimes that you wouldn't necessarily engage in because you're not making the proper application of pain and pleasure. The $10 word, psychopharmacological. There are psychopharmacological agents at play. Dope and alcohol. They're intoxicants. You're not necessarily making rational decisions when you have intoxicants on board. So if you see the term psychopharmacological, that is a critique. That idea that there are things that you can enter into your body that you put in your body that will make you make less rational decisions would be a critique wherein folks like Bentham and Beccaria said that all folks are rational. Perhaps they're not. Maybe they started out rational, but they have some temporary irrationality. You guys enjoy your holiday weekend.